Yeah, 1 second. There we go. Yeah.
Hello. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll just give music for I feel like I do an announcement.
Turn it off, I suppose. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The wonderful thing is that the fact that you come shows people it's again and actually if you look at the company fringe and the different events that have been happening over the course of this at this conference, there has been a significant number of conversations about climate and the environment and so many other different issues. And I remember coming to conference, I've been coming to conference about 12 years now. And I think this is the biggest programme in terms of the climate agenda and the conversations that have been had. Because it is significantly important, isn't it? Can everyone hear me at the back, by the way? Just, yes, great. What we've seen over the last few years, and when we think of the impact that climate is having at home and abroad, internationally, on nature, on humans, and then we see the inability of governments to really seem to be able to tackle this in a way that we know needs to happen if we're really going to reach our carbon targets. And it was disappointing to a number of people, even over the last few weeks, with Rishi Sunak rolling back on some of the climate commitments that we'd already made. And what was most disappointing for organisations like myself, I'm Jessie Jo Jacobs, and I'm the director of the UK Democracy Network, and we're hosted by Involve, which is a public participation charity, and we do a lot of the citizens' assemblies, and we run a lot of climate assemblies. And one of the big recommendations from the public during the climate assembly in Scotland was that the public did not want climate to be made a political fight. They wanted it to be non-party. They wanted basically parties to get over their colours and put the planet and people at the forefront. But what looks like we're seeing, we saw it in the Uxbridge by-election where ULEZ was politicised. We've seen it, as I said, in the last couple of weeks, where it seems like being committed to tackling climate change is becoming a culture war around winning votes. And that's absolutely devastating for the future of this movement and for what we're wanting to achieve. So we wanted to have the conversation today about, well, is there a problem with our democracy? And how do we think about how governance works in terms of achieving net zero, in terms of achieving our carbon targets, in terms of achieving the change that we need to make? And so we've got a wonderful panel. And I'm so if we can give really big prizes to panelists, the fact that you all have come today, knowing that it is the last day of conference, is just we're just really, really thankful that you be part of this debate. And so we've got basically people representing the kind of national perspective from Parliament. We've got local government, we've got regional government, and then we've got Sarah Costello, who's about to join us, who is one of the organisations that ran the Citizens' Assembly. So we'll look at the 4 areas of basically what does democracy need to look like? How do we respond at those different levels? And so I'm going to hand over to Ollie first, because he's the first that has to leave, and then we'll go through and hear the comments, and Sarah will be joining us. So just anyway, over to you, Ollie.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? And Jessie's absolutely right. I feel like we all deserve t-shirts or something, some sort of club. This is the hardcore of Labour conference, Wednesday morning in the rain, 10 a.m. We need some camaraderie. I think in the booklet it says that Andy Burnham is down to speak, so it sort of makes me feel slightly better about the fact that the room isn't packed out, that it's Andy's fault essentially. But look, I will do my best to be a sub for Andy Burnham, who's brilliant. Look, this issue is clearly urgent, right? And we all know that, right? I imagine that's the reason you're all here on a wet, rainy 10 a.m., as Jessie says, because this is an urgent I can, absolutely. My name's Oliver Coppard. I'm the Mayor of South Yorkshire, the Metro Mayor of South Yorkshire, not Andy Burnham.
But still northern.
Still northern. I'm a northern mayor. We're all interchangeable.
Upgrade. We've got an
It's
upgrade to
essentially the same.
Yorkshire.
Sometimes I'm Tracy Braben, which is more interesting. Look, it's an urgent issue. Clearly, it's an urgent issue. We should treat it as an urgent issue. We should deal with it as an urgent issue. But that doesn't make it a simple issue, does it? We all know that. This is not an easy thing to solve. And the thing that I am most conscious of is we can't solve this without engaging our community. And that sounds like a really basic thing to say. And yet, in so much of this debate, the conversation focuses on what is government at any level going to do. And of course, government has a huge role to play. In South Yorkshire, I have a huge role to play, I hope, in solving the problem of climate breakdown. But the reality is that nothing I do in South Yorkshire is going to change the course globally for how we address this challenge. But what we can do in South Yorkshire is show some leadership to our communities and do this in a way which shows other people how to get to collectively a better place. And that's what I think we're trying to do in my region. We are in the process of developing a climate assembly, a citizens assembly for climate, which will be the biggest regional citizens assembly of its kind. I'm really proud of that. I think it's a really important signal that we're sending to the people of South Yorkshire that we're not going to do this to our communities, we're going to do it with our communities. I'll talk in a moment about what that citizens assembly looks like, but first of all, why we're doing it. South Yorkshire, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield suffered through the last energy transition. So the last energy transition away from coal, South Yorkshire was one of the big losers of that. And my community still bears the scars of that transition. So I am absolutely clear in my mind that whatever we do to get to net zero in South Yorkshire has to recognise and reconcile the fact that people in South Yorkshire are often scared of what that transition might look like, because they remember what it looked like before when we were asked to move to a different type of energy environment. I ran something called the Dearne Valley Ecovision before I got this job, and that was an attempt to try and make what was once the most polluted place in Western Europe, the Dearne Valley, where all the coal mines of South Yorkshire used to be, and transform that into the most sustainable region, part of the country, a sustainable community of its kind in the country. And when we were doing that, one of the things that I was most acutely conscious of is we couldn't just talk about costs, because that community knows all too well what the costs of transition look like. What you've really got to do is spell out the opportunities of that transition. And so the Citizens Assembly that we're now leading, we've sent out 30,000 letters to randomly assigned households. My mum's best mate got one, my next door neighbour got one. They didn't open them, which is a slight issue, but we are getting there. We're trying to find 100 people who will be demographically representative of the region as a whole, both in terms of their gender, their location, their financial means, their values, etc., right? Because we want 100 people who represent the region. And what we're going to talk about in those series of meetings, and it will run over the course of a number of weeks, and we're paying people to be part of that, which I think is a fundamentally important part of this, because it can't just be wealthy people who've got loads of access to cash already and have a certain viewpoint and view of the world. It needs to be everybody in our region. We're going to be talking about trade-offs, because those trade-offs are where the danger is, where the difficulty is, where the complexity is. And we've seen that, haven't we, with things that Rishi has been saying recently in places like South Yorkshire, where we've had huge issues with like LTNs and whether or not they are viable or a positive thing or not. So that transition through a series of trade-offs, we're going to ask our community how to get through it. And that's why it's fundamentally important. And look, we are going to do a bunch of other things besides. It won't stop at the Climate Assembly. I'm interested in the idea of citizens' juries and other forms of representative democracy versus participative democracy. But whatever we do, I'm acutely conscious we're going to do this with our communities. We're going to take our communities with us. We're going to show leadership in South Yorkshire for everybody else. And we're going to make that transition happen. But we're going to do that in a way which maximizes the benefits and the opportunities to the people of South Yorkshire, because I think that's the only way to get through it. And it is a huge opportunity to make our communities fairer and create a more just society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ollie. So what I'm going to do, because we're losing Ollie in about 5 minutes, I just want to give just a short round if anyone's got any particular comments or questions just based on what Ollie's mentioned, and then we will go back to the rest of the panel. So I'm going to take the lady at the back with the brilliant jacket. Yeah.
Always get your questions. So hi, I'm Claire Booker. I'm from Lichfield. I'm one of the councillors there. I'm married to someone from Sheffield. He's a Yorkshireman.
You married well.
Well, all my family are from Liverpool, but never mind. So my husband often comes home and he'll come home with a bag of peppers. And I'll be like, why did you buy the bag of peppers in the plastic? Because it was cheaper. Well, buy the single ones on their own. Well, I can get a whole bag for the same price. And I can't fault his logic. He's a Yorkshireman. He saves money. Whereas I'm like, I'd rather pay more and have the ones without the plastic, darling. He's intelligent. He's educated. He's married to me. So, you know, how do we get through to people like that? Well-educated people. You're preaching to the choir. But how do we get through to the well-educated people who know it's the right thing to do, but still go, but this is the cheaper one?
Great question. I'm going to come. So I'll do a few.
Sure.
I'd like a question from a young person. So if you're under 25, you've got an opportunity to ask the Mayor of Yorkshire a question or a comment. If yeah, okay.
It's not it's not really surrounding climate, but I was just wondering, do you think the Metro mayors should be given more powers, as in like decentralizing the powers? So, because obviously you know what's going on in your area, so do you think that's what should happen?
Brilliant question. And this gentleman at the front, on the front row. That's why you should give young people the opportunity to speak.
You mentioned how a lot of the work, probably the majority of the work for decarbonising is for national governments and international governments. So how does that connect with the local citizen assembly? Are they going to be recommending on that as well?
Okay, and those two questions I think are connected, aren't they? So let me answer the first question first. I'm glad that the Yorkshireman is confirming the stereotypes of being careful with cash. That's good to know. Look, how do we convince educated people? Well, how do we convince anyone, quite honestly? And I think most people are rational, aren't they? And I think we need to kind of recognize the fact that people are kind of making quite logical decisions quite often. If the peppers are cheaper to buy in a plastic bag, you buy them in a plastic bag, and I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for people want to do. And it does connect back to this question about what's the role of government, what's the role of metro mayors, because actually the structures around that mean that the peppers are cheaper in a plastic bag, but there's no reason why they should be cheaper in a plastic bag, because we can set the structures, the governance, the legislation which says they are not. They should not be cheaper in a plastic bag, and we can control that. So I think we have to get the signals in the market right. And when you look at some of the signals, particularly on some of the bigger issues around energy and how the energy market works in this country, the energy market doesn't promote things like renewable energy because the systems don't allow it to. So I think that's where this conversation comes back to people like me and government more broadly, is because we have to make sure that we're setting up the systems in a way that allows people to make better choices. And at the moment, we don't do that. And, you know, look, the obvious one that I deal with every day is transport, right? It's so much easier, and we're kind of in this debate at the moment, aren't we? It's so much easier to get in your car, and I do it, and we all do it, or a lot of us do it, right? We get in our car because it's easier to get somewhere. It's often cheaper to get somewhere by car than it is by train. It's often cheaper to fly than it is to go by train or public transport. And in that system, people are making choices all the time that is not good for the environment. We need to, this is the tragedy of the commons classically, right? We need to understand that the costs are borne somewhere, right? Albeit maybe not by the consumer. So make sure the costs are borne in the right place is what I would say. To come back to this question about kind of what role, like, great question. I could talk, like, how long have we got basically, right? Because yes, of course, Metro Mayor should have more power, right? More control, more funding, because when I make decisions, I look people in the eye. I often know the name of the person or the people I'm engaging with when I make that decision, the people who will be affected directly by the decisions that I make. So look, I am determined, and I think Keir is determined to work together to give Metro mayors more power under a Labour government. That's absolutely the direction of travel, and that's things like planning. That's things like certainly planning and housing, kind of how we build our economies in South Yorkshire and build them in a way which is aligned with the direction of travel of the climate, the economy in the UK. And I think this is where the question on the front row comes in. I think national government set a framework. So national government, hopefully a Labour government, saying this is what we're going to be great at in the next century, right? And Keir said this, and I think it's a great line. Somebody's going to have to lead the energy transition. Why not the UK? Someone's going to have to be the leader in offshore wind. Why not the UK? Right, etc. So, like, if national government set that framework and a Labour government set that framework, and then work with people like me to develop a regional industrial strategy which focuses and supports that national strategy, then we can just. There's no end to our ambition in that space. Because we can be brilliant. We already have the world's first advanced manufacturing innovation district in South Yorkshire, right? Rolls-Royce, Boeing, McLaren, the only place in the world where those companies are together in one space. I'm off to St. Louis and DC next week to talk to them about how they can develop their advanced manufacturing innovation district on the basis of what South Yorkshire's already done, because they see us as world leaders. So if we can do that, we can develop an economy which works for everybody, gives great new jobs in those industries of the future, change our economy, change how society works, and do that within the framework set by national government. Oh, I'm sorry, specific to the Assembly. So the question we want to ask our Assembly is not so much about specific policy areas, right? So I'm not saying, should we do X or should we do Y? Like, should we have public transport or should we allow everybody to drive? Because frankly, I'm not sure it's a very useful question. The Assembly is focused on values. So when we're engaged, because if you do it on policy issues, quite quickly it becomes out of date, right? So like within 6 months it's out of date. Should we do low traffic neighborhoods, policy changes, it becomes irrelevant. We're doing it on values. So essentially kind of helping us to understand what the values of our community look like so that we can start engaging in those conversations and those questions in a way which allows us to do it in line with what the community want and need. And I think that's probably a smarter way of doing it. So that will allow me to have a bit of ballast when I am engaging with private sector, our communities, government, that says my community wants this. They want me to approach this problem in this way and then take it forward like that.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you. And thank you very much. Sorry, I have to go.
Sorry?
And not straight away. No, Sheffield first and then and then on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ollie. So I'd next like to introduce Alex Sobel, who is the chair of CERA's parliamentary group, and he's also the chair of the Net Zero APPG. And I've known Alex for a long time, and he is just, he is pioneering the thought at the kind of parliamentary level on what we need to do, both on climate change, but also on democracy. So we're really pleased that you can join us today. Do we have a democracy fit for climate change? And what should it look like in the future?
We haven't got democracy fit for anything, I'm afraid to say. Climate change included. I'm going to go back a little bit earlier. So I'm an MP in Leeds, and people who know Leeds or don't know Leeds, it's not a city like Liverpool. Leeds City with towns and rural areas, Morley, Pudsey, Otley, Wetherby, Garforth. My constituency has over 100 farms in it. It is not an entirely urban city. Where I was on the council before I was an MP, I was the lead for climate change sustainability. Nobody will be surprised about that. I set up the Leeds Climate Commission with Professor Emily Goulson, University of Leeds. He was the chair, I was the vice chair. The first thing we did was set up a citizens' jury. So we did the citizens' jury process we started it just before I got elected to Parliament, 2017. It concluded early 2019 and reported. It had the very typical cross-section citizens' jury. I had two from my constituency. One was a student, the other one was the gardener at Harewood House. So they were a bit different. My constituency is, a bit more middle class than the other parts of Leeds, but there were very traditional working class people, very attached to their cars, not really the sort of people that are very engaged in the climate agenda as well. It was a very mixed group. the recommendations Citizens Jury came out with, a lot of them were normal sort of things you'd expect. But the two that really stood out for me, because I just didn't think that they get consensus on issues like this. So first one was congestion charge. Now, if you think about it, this was 2019, so they reported just before, no, not just before COVID, about 6 months before COVID hit. And the other one was an individual carbon budget, which obviously Leeds City Council couldn't implement in any way, shape or form. But actually, if you think about it, how to get consensus in a really broad demographic group in a city of 800,000 people with very sort of red wall type areas like Morley, very, poor working class areas, to get that sort of consensus is really interesting. And the Oversight Board had sort of the radical groups, some as well, Extinction Rebellion, Youth Climate Strike, yeah. So organisations like that, as well as the normal Friends of the Earth and etc., were on it. So, but it was led by the university and by the Voluntary Action League, which is the umbrella voluntary group, and the council sort of stood slightly back from it, which is fair enough. I think we've stood forwards from it. The Labour group stood forwards for it. Congestion charge never have got on because they'd have all gone. They've all had a slight nervous breakdown because, like, for years and on the council, I was always supporting congestion charge. I still am, because that's how we can fund public transport in the city. But you wouldn't get it through. Even now, you probably wouldn't get it through our Labour group, although the Labour group's a lot better than it was when I first went on the council. So that sort of deliberative democracy is really important. Those Citizens Jury recommendations did go to exec board. They were considered. You should have seen the leader of the Tory group. It was not pretty. His face was not pretty, because he didn't think that they would come up with things like that. So it sort of blew his mind a bit. He's no longer the leader of the Tory group. I'm not sure those two things are related. But much more widely, I'm very supportive of Citizens Jury, Citizens Assembly. I think at national level, we wouldn't call it a jury, at national level process. The most tricky social issue in the recent history of the Republic of Ireland is the issue of abortion. It was effectively resolved through a Citizens Assembly, and I think it's really useful for individual. That's an individual sort of issue. I think can be really difficult to break through some of those issues, like implementing congestion charge, regulating for carbon market, carbon budget. I think let's do one to solve all the issues around climate change and try. I don't think that would work. But I also don't think that Citizens Assemblies, Citizens Juries should have direct democratic powers. So, that's what you sort of get ending up at sortition then. I'm very opposed to sortition for a whole number of reasons. But I do think that we need to do a number of things to transform our democracy to make it fit for the challenges of climate. So we do need to have different pre-legislative actions, which would include, I think, forms of Citizens Jury and Citizens Assemblies run independently, although I think they should be funded by the state, which I imagine you probably agree with. But not for everything. I don't think we should turn into some sort of Swiss style democracy. And I also think, and I know I probably get some support in the room, I also think that we need to change the voting system because it votes as consensus building. And I think we're nearly there. I think democracy is catching up with culture, but we just need to push it over the line.
That's great. Thank you, Alex. And so we now have Sarah Castell, who's the chief exec of Involve, and Involve have been leading on a number of climate assemblies for a number of years, and are probably really are the pioneers and the leading charity in the UK on this issue. So Sarah, over to you. Do we have a democracy fit for climate change?
Thanks, Jessie. Hello, can everyone hear? Yeah. The rain is drumming ever louder on the roof, so it's harder to make ourselves heard. I love that expression, Alex, that democracy is catching up with culture. And I think I'm probably going to support what Oliver and Alex have already said about the role of deliberative democracy, particularly in the climate space, and that the two can go. I think Oliver said sort of versus representative democracy. I don't think he meant that, because that isn't the way he works. I think he meant deliberative democracy hand in hand with representative democracy, because it's that they are both very, very important in terms of making sure that we have a real public mandate for making the changes we have to make and the trade-offs that we're going to need to see. So Rishi Sunak is right in a way that the media debate about climate is often characterised by two extremes and an adversarial way of talking about things. Where I don't think he's right is that means, oh, well, we have to sort of start again and ask people, and we can't really make any decisions or move on anything. We have done a lot of public engagement on climate. There's been a lot, all of the examples that Alex mentioned and Oliver's work, and I'm going to talk about a few other examples. There's been a lot of work with the public on what they think, and there are some very, very key themes that come out. And the first theme is cross-party leadership. The public did not want the climate to be used as a political football, and it's just not the space for this kind of point scoring. And I would urge a Labour government, if they were in power, to rise above that as well, because it's the main thing that the public want. They want climate solutions that are fair and a just transition, and they want public engagement on a more strategic scale. So I'm really excited to hear, the linking between the national picture around, for example, like the big climate assembly that 6 select committees of the House of Commons did, and the Scottish Climate Assembly. There's been some very big national and even international, bodies that have done this, and there's a lot of local and regional work done as well. But what we don't have at the moment is that link together into a public engagement strategy for climate. And I think that's something that would help everybody in the public understand the role of these different mechanisms in finding out what we should do and exploring different alternatives and looking at everything from the values level through to the level of specific policies, through to the hyper-local, when your low traffic neighbourhood turns up in your high street and it's gone completely over your head and you've missed it, and then suddenly the bus lane has moved. What are you going to think about that if you've got no understanding of how that fits with a broader agenda? Then you're going to resist it and reject it. And we've seen with things like ULEZ that if the public haven't been brought along on the journey, if they've not been taken on that journey, they can just go wah, wah, at the end and say no thank you. Involves written all sorts of things about this. We've written a guide recently for the role of government in engaging on climate that has a lot of this useful stuff in. I think there's what I want to give you, I guess, is I feel that this is quite a friendly room to climate assemblies and deliberative democracy around climate. And I want to give you the ammunition. So when people say to you, oh, well, aren't they just sort of Extinction Rebellion kind of radical things to push through policies that people don't want? I want you to be able to say, no, they do. They unlock political stalemates, and they make better policies that work for people on the ground, and they are vital tools. So my selfish aim in doing this panel is to enable all of you to go out and say that, because that helps my agenda out involve in getting deliberative democracy more off the ground, and it helps us, I think, with our climate challenge. So you could talk about wind farms. You could say that in Devon there was a really vocal majority against onshore wind. Ed Miliband wants to beef up onshore wind. Great. He'll need to kind of get over that feeling in local areas that maybe people don't want it. The Devon Climate Assembly, the Devon Citizens Assembly about wind went to 9 out of 10 people at the end of that said we do think that there should be onshore wind in Devon, and we don't think that everyone in the community should be able to veto it. We think that there should be an easier way of unlocking that, and that was through a reflective, nice, long-term process. All people from all walks of life hearing and thinking about the issues. Another really interesting one is the Kendal Climate Jury, where that was, and again, it was all done online through the pandemic. The great people of Kendal managed to sort of hold it together through the pandemic and have this online discussion about climate. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was not only a whole suite of recommendations on everything from food and allotments and probably vegetable packaging too, and gardening and housing and energy efficiency, which gave a kind of whole lot of mandates to the local authority to do things, but also they led to the establishment of a volunteer group that then helped the council do their solar power audit. So it wasn't only just kind of getting support for the council, but actually unlocking some civic activism to make changes and giving people a bit more agency themselves in what was going to happen. So I think that just shows a nice trajectory from getting people more involved to actually people being able to take action on the things that matter to them. And that's what this is all about. Yeah, I'll finish because I've got other things I can say, but I'll sort of leave it there. I think I wanted to leave with the thought that while face-to-face and online public engagement and citizens' assemblies, all the sorts of things that we do at Involve, I think they're a really vital part of the puzzle. There's also lots more scope to create communities around climate change which may be place-based in a different way or may link up places across the country. So I just wanted to mention Octopus Energy has this great map of places around the country who are amenable to onshore wind, and they call it Tinder for Wind. Winder, which I always, that's why I remember it, right? And now you'll all remember it too. So there you go. And that's just a very simple visual identification of a community support for something. And I think we could think a lot more creatively and bring in business and link those up with government at local and national level to try and get a greater sort of deeper sense of community engagement, both breadth and depth on all these issues. And I'll finish there, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. There's some fascinating insights there, and I'm sure the audience will want to dig a bit deeper. We do have chairs, so please do come to the front. We've got, if you can fill up, we've got about 5 seats here. We've got about 5 seats there, and we've got 2 at the front. They do have Chester Zoo bags on, but you can probably take the seat and maybe the bag as well. You get lucky, as long as it doesn't have things in it and it belongs to someone. So I'm really delighted that Tim Raukins can join us today. He's from Brighton City Council, and a very newly led Labour council, and so Tim is the chair of the City Environment of South Downs and Sea Committee, what does this mean at a local council level? And I'd be really interested in the insights of kind of what's happening in Brighton and what some of your ideas are there that needs to maybe change to be able to get more of the kind of climate commitments through at a local level.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm also not Andy Burnham. You would have hopefully noticed that. I sort of feel like, I mean, yeah, the first thing to say is that we resoundingly destroyed the Greens in Brighton and Hove in May. We went from, well, they had 20 councillors, they went down to 7. We had 16 and went to 38. So we now have majority control of that, of the city. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I think that it seems to me that essentially what we have is, you know, societally and globally is a 20th century system with a climate crisis kind of bolted onto it, and we're trying to find solutions within the confines of pre-existing structures and limitations. And I think the lady in the fabulous coat, did you say it was, which I definitely agree with, you know, the peppers example is a great example of that. Those peppers are cheaper because they're wrapped in plastic, they have a longer shelf life, therefore they're sold at a cheaper price to consumers. I think one of the other big examples of that is the persistent pegging of renewably generated energy to gas prices, right? Mm-hmm. So energy that's produced from wind is bought or sold at the same price as gas, and you know, I think that's another good example of that. And I think until we sort of start to, especially when you look at how much cheaper, I think it's 9 times cheaper renewable energy is than fossil fuel derived energy, and until that is reflected in the price people are paying, you know, that's going to be very difficult. So I think as a result of that, we've had very sort of slow progress for decades. And I've got a little boy, he's 4, and I sort of imagine him when he grows up, and young people now coming out into the world that we've sort of bequeathed to them, sort of turning around to us and saying, "Oh, you guys have only just found out about this climate crisis thing, right?" Because you know, it really feels like we've been talking about it for decades, and we're really only just, even if it's debatable whether we are, just starting to kind of really sort of coalesce around it and make some significant moves on it. It's been touched on earlier, the need to sort of take people along with you. We have, this is a bit of an aside, but we have, so part of the remit of my committee is, so Brighton and Hove, 44% of the city of Brighton and Hove sits in the South Downs National Park. And we're very unusual as a local authority. We own all of the South Downs lands that sits within the confines of the city. We own it. And that means that we can change how it's used. And we have a thing in Brighton and Hove called the City Downland Estate Plan, which has not just cross-party support, but support from the farming community and all sorts of other people in and around the city, South Downs National Park Authority, and various others. And I think what's interesting about that is that it's a plan that describes the practical steps necessary and people have coalesced around that. So it's not just about. I feel with climate change, there is enough consensus now that we need to take action, but where you get into the weeds of it is what that looks like, and you've seen that with the ULEZ debacle in London and everything. It's once you start putting forward policies and things that impact people's lives, that's where people start to, that's where things can come unstuck from a democratic point of view. So I think, with the Downland Estate Plan, we have a very, the aim of that is to essentially move a whole swathe of farmland away from a 20th century intensive farming model to a more sustainable regenerative farming model over a period of time. And that, because that plan is very clearly set out and everyone has buy-in and is sort of engaged with it, we're now just implementing it, and there's no real sort of controversy around that. So I realise that's a big leap to get to that stage, but I think we need to start building a much broader consensus around the practical things we need to do to get on top of the climate and nature crises. And then governments and local authorities and metro mayors and everything are just one stakeholder in sort of bringing about that change. Finally, just as a cautionary tale, we're talking about democracy here. Democracy delivered a green administration, two green administrations actually, in the city of Brighton and Hove. And I can tell you that the progress on carbon neutrality in Brighton and Hove is shockingly bad. I think we suspected it, but once we sort of took over and realised where the plan was, I mean, there wasn't a plan basically. I mean, all they really did was jotted down 2030 on the back of a fag packet, and sort of, that was kind of the end of it. So yeah, there's a lot to do, and I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to ask another round of questions, and again, I'd like to start with a question from a young person. So if you're under 30, you get your opportunities to put your hand up and ask your question first. Okay, no, genuinely. Well, I'll definitely take the question from the lady here. I will take 3 questions. So if you've got a question, and I'd like to see some sort of hands from around the room as well. So so we'll go this lady here. Then there's a woman. Sorry, my mum would tell me the same thing. Over to you.
Great.
I'm from Stroud, and in Stroud we have the only wind turbine in AONB. And it was built probably about 15 years ago, and it generates electricity, which keeps the council chamber in Stroud going. That's my first thing. But if there is a new national planning policy, will they make sure that all the environmental stuff that can be put into houses will be there? So we're building passive houses. Will any social housing, affordable housing that's been going to be built also be built as passive housing and possibly fully accessible? And are house builders going to be lobbied to do this? Because I know it's more expensive to build in that way. And finally, the LGA, I think, have a role to play in all this. Is there now a sort of a general scrutiny committee which looks at issues to do with climate change? Because what would be really helpful is if there could be information about what other councils are doing, so we can all learn from each other.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So this man at the front, not a gentleman, I won't call you a gentleman. So to get into trouble.
So I'm reminded of a quote from a Gillette Jones protester in France when somebody asked him, "Are you concerned about the end of the world?" And he said, his response was, "I'm more concerned about making it to the end of the week." So I suppose my question is, how much of a barrier are the intersectional struggles faced by disabled people and working class people in terms of support for climate change policies, and how do we overcome those barriers? Thanks.
Great question. And I think there was a question. Was there a question here? Yeah, this lady here. Woman.
Hi. We know that globally, the top 10% of earners, I can't remember the exact stat, but I'm going to say 40% are responsible for 40% of carbon emissions. I think it's a little bit less. But we also know that the more you earn, the more you care about the environment, and the more educated you are, the more you care about the environment. So that's a real conundrum. I just wondered what the panel could say about that.
Okay, Alex, shall we start with you?
Yeah, I'll take those last two because I think they're very much related. Look, in terms of intersectional struggles, take transport, for instance, us having a fully accessible public transport fleet, that is both a climate and a disability action. You're taking both actions at the same time. So you're moving people out of their cars, and you're improving the public transport system and reducing emissions. I love Motability, but there's far too many Motability cars on the road because disabled people can't access public transport, so they have to utilize those cars. In terms of, the high earners, the stat that I always use, because it's about individual choice, is aviation. 70% of flights taken by 15% of people. So it's really difficult. Actually, aviation is really difficult. It's around 4% of emissions globally. The UK a bit more than that, so we fly a bit more. And what you don't want to do, and this comes back to the intersectional struggles, is say to people who go on holiday once a year for some winter sun, or take their kids on holiday during the summer, or they've got a family member living in Spain, they go and see them, say, you can't go to visit your family. Obviously, there's a little bit of if we had really high speed rail, then maybe they go that way and it was cheaper than flying. But that's a bit more long term ask, sort of. Well, yes, it is a bit more long term ask if we think about it last week's Tory Party conference. But equally, those are not the people really ramping up aviation emissions. It's the high earners, particularly those with their own planes, like the Prime Minister, who utilize those emissions. And how do we resolve that, or how do we start to balance that? Are big questions for governments. A carbon market, carbon regulation is one of those. The easiest solution, which I do not think will appear in the Labour manifesto, radical solution. If you Google me and this, you'll see that I'm on the record, so I don't feel I'm really anything new, is that we have a frequent flyer tax. Yeah. And it's an escalator tax. So you have your first flight. So if you're the family of 5 going to see, your grandmother who lives in the Canaries once a year, you won't be paying that tax. But if you're, I don't know, I'll just pick somebody random, Roman Abramovich, then, by the 15th flight of the year, that's going to cost you a couple of million, quid. That's where we should be getting to. And then, although he'll pay it, at least that'd be money in the exchequer to alleviate some of the climate, be a bit of climate mitigation money, wouldn't it?
Sarah, so there's a question on intersectionality, and was there interested to hear the kind of I guess on the climate assemblies, and are they the makeup of those? Do you see kind of different? Tell us a bit more of your experience with that.
Yeah, I think the intersectional point is really, really crucial, because none of us can imagine the experience of all of us, and that's why we need to come together and have groups that find common ground. A just transition does mean, not quite literally throwing people with disabilities under the bus, or quite literally, stopping people doing what they want to do. But it does involve the people being able to speak to one another and explore the issues as to where they come from. And I think that's where you pick up the point about people from different points on the social map, people with different levels of education, different levels of income. It's what can we all agree is fair. And actually, I find in myself, and I find when I go to these events and talk to people, what people see as fair changes when they've heard the voices of other people. So we've got much more in common than what divides us. We've got much more capacity to move and shift our own behaviour if we see it in the context of, a wider social contract. And that's why I think these kind of democratic innovations of coming together and talking in a more sort of restorative way, in a way that heals us of our divisions. It's not just good for making good climate policy, although that would be a start, right? It's also good for just giving us a slightly less adversarial culture where we're not so pulled apart and divided, and where where then the kind of extremism of media algorithms or whatever it is that pushes us to extremes doesn't have so much of a say. We did a lovely project called the People's Plan for Nature, which I'd advise you to go and have a look at. It was for the WWF and RSPB and National Trust all funded it, and there were some other funders behind it too. But it was 100 people from all walks of life, and lots of people there had all different kinds of things that they brought to the table, whether they were living with disabilities or illnesses, or whether they'd come from different places in the country, rural and urban people of all ages. And it was just wonderful to see how they formed into a sort of really beautiful group, because they were all focusing on restoring nature and protecting nature and all of the things that fall out from that, food and transport, and what they were prepared to do and what they felt others should be prepared to do as well. Because none of us like to be taking the hit if we're feeling that, you know, Roman Abramovich or the director of the company on the high street that's making us, you know, buy expensive peppers is jetting around in their private plane. So we like to feel that we're part of a community. And I think when you've got a group of diverse people coming together, it makes it a more powerful ask when you're asking other decision makers to also come in and do their bit.
Nobody tweet about Roman Abramovich. We don't want to get sued.
Jim.
Yeah, so briefly on the planning and housing thing, I mean, the obviously planning regulation is largely set centrally. So I think from a local authority perspective, we just need to be pushing beyond, so that we're not just doing the minimum requirement in terms of energy efficiency and stuff, but really sort of pushing that as far as we can. And that's particularly relevant in a city like ours in Brighton, where we have a lot of very old housing with, a lot of conservation areas and these kinds of things. Incidentally, I think we're going to have to start having a conversation about conservation areas, because in the context of the climate crisis, I don't know if it's tenable to require old buildings to keep hold of their single glazed sash windows. It can be done, and it certainly needs to be. So I think we need to push as hard as we can as local authorities on that. It's another example of where what we really need with all this stuff is joined up central government and joined up local authorities. And reading between the lines, what I mean is a joined up Labour government with joined up Labour local authorities, really sort of coalescing around this stuff moving forward. In terms of the support for people on low incomes and stuff, I mean, a lot of this is just about the systems, right? I mean, renewable energy is already far cheaper, so there's already the possibility for families and people on lower incomes to be paying a lot less for their energy, for example. These are just sort of policy choices, really. And yeah, I mean, Alex mentioned the idea of a frequent flyer tax. I think that's a brilliant idea. And that, there's things that exist already which are low hanging fruit. I mean, so private jet flights are exempt from VAT, and that is, that has been insane for a long time from a basic equalities perspective. But when you add in the climate, that's just a thing that should have been done a long time ago, right? That's not something that we really need to be thinking about a great deal. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Don't do school fees and not that.
All right, we'll have another round of questions. The man here with the hat, woman here at the back with the blonde hair, and young man with the navy jacket.
Hello, my name is Richard Maisie from Stroud, and I was in Extinction Rebellion for a little while. And what I don't think is being emphasised here, perhaps it has been a lot previously, is the urgency of the situation. Labour are putting it forward. We've had a huge delay because of the Tories completely ignoring the subject, really. They can talk about it, but they do nothing. And we're now in a position where we hopefully will be in government, and hopefully we will be taking it forward. And there are 5 missions, Labour said. There's only one mission, as far as I'm concerned, which is our future and relates to the environment. And I entirely agree that we should have citizens' assemblies to discuss it, but how much time we've got to do that, because none of these things are worthwhile unless we also try and convince the rest of the world to do the same thing. So we could spend a lot of money. So there are existing organisations, and I know a parish councillor, for example, near Cheltenham, who's already putting environmental issues into her parish by her own persuasion of people and talking about education. All I'm really emphasizing is that we haven't got a lot of time, and the quicker we can do it and the way we can do it as quickly as possible is essential to resolve the situation anyway, or we'll just hit a trigger point and won't be here.
Hi, my name's Alice, and I'm from the World Biogas Association. And I have a question that's, I think, predominantly for Sarah, but also I'd love to hear the thoughts of the rest of the panel as well. And it's about how to combat prominent sources of misinformation, particularly when you're trying to build biogas plants, in my case, in local communities. I spend a lot of my time going through sort of newspaper articles and letters which contain really just false, basically, information about the impact that biogas plants or wind farms or any other sort of energy-based plants are going to have on the local community. So with biogas, for example, it's that biogas plants are going to smell, which actually isn't true at all. The biomethane fuel that's produced from them has no scent. This is a very sort of common fact that all climate scientists will know. But it's also something which is in a lot of very prominent publications. Got the Daily Mail, and then also sometimes the Guardian and the Independent, and really just sources that have a monopoly on people's sense of trust and truth. And so my question is, any tips or tricks or strategies for combating those prominent sources of misinformation as sort of a local association or a local company that's trying to build one of these plants?
Hi, I'm Harrison Humby from Keele University, and I was just wondering about, with this Citizens Assembly, I think it's really, really good with funding people to go to them to make it accessible. I think that's really, really important to get all voices involved. But I was wondering about how is it, or how could it be made accessible for young people who are in education, who giving them money, it's not like a job, it can't just go away. Is there a way of making it accessible for young people? Especially to get a mix of people who are inside education as well as outside education. Thank you.
Great question. So I think I'll start with Tim this time, and we'll go that way.
Yeah. So, Richard, on the urgency thing, I mean, I completely agree. Obviously, I mean, I sort of think about this as, you know, imagine if we knew nothing about the climate crisis up until today, and today we found out everything that we now know in one go. We would be freaking out, right? And to some extent we are, but our freaking out is happening on a sort of chronic basis. And you know, the fact that we've been talking about this for so long, climate change, net zero, carbon emissions, biodiversity, all the rest of it, is now just become like a constant presence in everyone's lives. And I think that's dangerous, because it then just recedes into the background, and then other things start to take over. I don't know what the answer to that is, but you know, we do need to start thinking about it as a, and I mean, it is being, I think it is coming up, coming more into the foreground in the last year or two, where we've seen, you know, wildfires in Kent, and you know, mid-August, mid-20s up at Labour conference in Liverpool. You know, there are the effects of climate change, which I think most people thought would be at some point in the future, are happening now, and they're happening regularly. So I think that's obviously a very bad, terrifying thing. But I would hope that it does focus the minds a little bit, and inject some very much needed urgency into it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think to a large extent those roles exist. It's just that they exist within that slow burning. I hasten to use the word glacial, because that feels inappropriate when we're talking about climate change. But you know, the pace of it. So it's a big challenge. And you know, this links on to Alice's question about misinformation. I think a lot of the time, misinformation loves a vacuum, right? If you have a gap of information, it gets filled by, and it's often fear-based. It gets filled by what people are scared of about the given suggestion or proposal. So this isn't the whole answer, but I think much more proactive and preemptive communications around this is really important, and looking at successes from elsewhere and really sort of championing those and making sure that those are kind of well understood. Citizens' assemblies, making them more accessible for young people. I think we all would love that idea. I mean, when I grew up, there was the whole sort of trope of like, the youth of today, with a bit of an eye-rolling thing. Whenever I encounter young people across all walks of life, really, it just blows my mind how switched on and engaged and passionate, and it makes me feel pretty sheepish about how I was when I was, coming out of school. So I think we do need to make them more accessible, but I think that that is a captive audience, and I think that if we provide those opportunities, I think the people that we really need to engage, everybody, but it's big corporations, it's governments, it's the big players and the big emitters that need to be a core part of that conversation.
Right. So on the first one, and this is my 5th or 6th climate panel, this conference, and I've said it every other panel, so I'll say it here as well. The climate crisis isn't a future crisis. The climate crisis is a now crisis. We are living in the midst of the climate crisis, and it's currently in the current news cycle. It's being, unfortunately, slightly dimmed because we're having so much military action and war, quite frankly. But every day there is a climate story, whether it's flooding, wildfires, whatever it is, and we are living through the midst of it. And so we need to view it slightly differently. And your follow-up point about on councils we need environment officers. Well, on Leeds City Council, we don't have one executive member who covers these areas. We have 2. So we've got an executive member for environment and climate, and we have an executive member who in the old days would have been called the executive member for transport and planning and other related things, and is now the executive member for sustainable development. So that's a third of the executive job titles on the council really are to do with that. And you might say, well, they all should be to do with that, but that 20 years ago there was nobody, and 10 years ago one, so now it's 2. And actually, if you look at the job titles across the senior leadership team, again, there's a number which sit. So it's not about an environment officer's very junior position in local authority. These are directors, and executive members. So I think, and I'm sure that most Labour authorities are like that, and most Labour authorities have introduced a climate committee. I can't remember what it's called in Leeds Climate Adaptation Committee, I think, and the chair's a senior councillor. It's not somebody who came on the council no offence, last year or this year. Somebody's been on the council quite a while. It's quite difficult when everybody's new practically, but so I think when I talked to Bev Craig at Manchester or Liam Robinson here in Liverpool, big urban and local authorities, we're all very similar. I mean, I'm not a councillor anymore, but I'm still quite close to the piece. In terms of myth busting, so I've got a friend who's actually my landlord in London, and he runs the Global Strategic Communications Council, and his job is to push back against the fossil fuel industry, and at an international level, their greenwashing of their practices, and they're trying to slow down. What's happening now really isn't that you've got climate deniers, you've got climate delayers. So our biggest problem is climate delayers. There are deniers. I'm not denying there are deniers, but they're not actually that influential. It's delayers that have got the real influence. Yeah. And that was spun out. I used to run the European Climate Foundation. That's been spun out of that because they understood the importance of comms and communication and public narrative in sort of a much more mundane way. As chair of the all-party group on net zero, we've produced a myth-busting guide to actually help. And it's really interesting. Industries, and private sector, what you want to call it, is very divided on this. And the analogy that I always use is, imagine this was 1900 and you're a carriage maker. Your 20-year plan is to make carriages with better rubber wheels and more comfy upholstery, in 20 years' time, you have no business. You know, all the carriage makers survived, all started making cars. Now all the car makers that are going to survive, they're all on the net zero pathway to make electric vehicles, which is why they're all mad as hell about the pushback to 2035. Have a real impact actually in the northeast on Nissan. But we have people whose only real business is fossil fuel business. I'm not going to name it because I definitely will get sued if you tweet it out. And those people are trying to delay it, to try and run their business as long as possible, to try and extract as much value as possible. They don't frankly give a shit about the climate. They just care about building a bigger house and having more money to leave for their kids. So those are that's where the issue is. And as a government, we need to, one, put very clear guardrails so everybody has to go down the path as quickly as possible, and two, actually encourage those that are moving at the right pace in the right way, and encourage those and create disincentives for all the others that are delayers. And I think that's not the framing or the narrative. That is effectively where Labour policy will be, because we're trying to meet our Paris commitments, we're trying to create the transitional path, and we're trying to take people with us.
Thanks, Alex. And Sarah, our final comment of the morning, if you'd like to wrap us up.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to address the question about misinformation. I think that's really important. And because everyone else has been so brilliant, I've devised a 4-point plan for you by just listening to what they've said and adding some thoughts. Yeah, I think if we could attack the big scale misinformation, then we'd be sitting in a different place with probably different challenges. It's a huge challenge that goes across everything. So I'm not even going to attempt to say how do you sort of break the power of bad actors in the media in that way. But I think if you're trying to build something somewhere specifically and countering those myths, I think your first option is the proactive option. As we've heard, the misinformation likes a vacuum. So going to the places and the second point is about being very open. So not seeking to just doing one-way communication, but hearing where people are from to start with. So even if they're coming and they're telling you things to be untrue, you've got to give people space to talk about it and hear them and hear why they think that and what matters to them. It's your starter question is always, what matters to you about this? What's been happening here and why does it matter to you? And I think there's a lot of work on sort of place-based work we've just done. It reminded me of some work we've just done with the Impact Investing Institute around place-based impact investing and how you engage people with that. So I think there's something about your investment community and getting them all to sort of sing from the same song sheet around how to talk and debate this and bring it to the public. And then I think your third point is about case studies. So we heard that here as well, getting some really good examples of where it's worked and proving the benefits. So that you can, again, counter the misinformation just with a steady, calm stream of real information. And then I think your fourth point is about networking and sharing and getting others to say the same things as you and getting the message amplified. And those are probably, being proactive, being open, getting good case studies and networking and sharing are probably some quite good principles, I think, for public engagement and moving climate action forward at every scale. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. This is the last of our panels. I think we've had 19 over the course of this week, so it's been fantastic. If you're not a member of CERA, please do join. It's very, very affordable. It's about £2 a month, £3 a month. But everything that we've been able to do this week is because of our members. And we are the only affiliated environmental society to the Labour Party. We have the ear of the shadow cabinet, of the leadership. This is a campaign that has been going for 50 years, and it's probably the most important in terms of climate and the proximity to power and our ability to affect change and bring these conversations to the ears of the people who will have that position to do something about it. So do join CERA. And then my other hat, the Democracy Network, do join us as well, because we're about making sure that we've got a stronger democracy. We have organisations there that are PR, that are citizens' assemblies, trying to look at House of Lords reform. It's two very, very important agendas. And actually democracy, I always feel, is a first order. It's a first order. It's like we get the decision making right. We get how decisions are made, how democracy works, how the governance works, then we're going to get the sort of decisions that will protect our people and the planet for the next 50 years. So thank you very much for joining us, and go and enjoy the lovely Liverpool weather.